The first thing Warlord Kesrat did when I walked into his throne hall was count me. He raised one long finger, pointed it at my chest, and said the word slowly, like he was tasting it. 1. Then he laughed, and his whole court laughed with him, and the sound rolled across that enormous hall like thunder trapped in a metal box. My name is Clara Hart. I am an ambassador of the Terran Accord, and on that day I was the only human being within 400 light years. I stood alone on a black stone floor, in a hall built for giants, surrounded by hundreds of armored Korvath warriors, and I kept my hands folded in front of me and waited for the laughter to stop. It took a while. Kesrat was massive, even for his kind, gray-plated skin, 4 eyes stacked in pairs, a cloak made from the banners of species he had conquered. He leaned forward on his throne and studied me the way you might study an insect that had wandered onto your dinner table. "Where is your escort, little creature?" he asked. "Where are your ships? Where are your soldiers? My sensors show one small vessel, unarmed, and one small passenger, also unarmed. Did your species truly send you here alone?" "I am never alone," I told him. "My bodyguard is the entire Terran Vanguard." The hall went quiet for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then the laughter came back twice as loud. Kesrat slapped the arm of his throne. His generals howled. Somewhere behind me, a guard laughed so hard he had to lean on his weapon. "The entire Terran Vanguard," Kesrat repeated, wiping at his lower eyes. "And where is this mighty vanguard hiding? In your pocket? In your boot?" "They are exactly where they need to be," I said, "and I came to talk, not to threaten. You are holding 3,000 refugees from the Ashari worlds. Those people were granted Terran protection before your ships took them. I am here to bring them home. Release them, and this ends today, with trade agreements and open borders. That is the offer." Kesrat stopped laughing. He rose from his throne, and the floor actually trembled when he stepped down, and he crossed the hall toward me with slow, heavy strides. He crouched so that his 4 eyes were level with my 2, and this close I could feel the heat coming off his armor. "Let me explain something, human," he said quietly. "I have broken 12 star systems. I have taken the surrender of admirals whose fleets darkened the sky. And your species, this small, soft, unknown species from some backwater rock, sends me 1 female with no weapon and a speech about protection. Do you know what that tells me? It tells me your Terran Accord is a lie, a bluff, an empty name." He straightened up and held out his hand. An officer placed my diplomatic credentials in it, the sealed folio with the blue and silver crest of Earth. Kesrat held it up for the whole court to see. "This," he announced, "is what Terra is worth." Then he crushed it, and a soldier put a torch to the pieces, and I stood there and watched my credentials burn on the black stone floor while the court cheered. Every camera in that hall was recording. Every vassal lord from every conquered system was watching the feed. Kesrat wanted witnesses to my humiliation. He was going to get witnesses, just not to that. "Take her below," he said, turning back toward his throne. "The little ambassador will be my guest until Terra pays a proper ransom for her. And if Terra does not pay, we will learn what humans are made of the hard way." 2 guards seized my arms. Their hands were so large that their fingers overlapped around my elbows. As they turned me toward the doors, I twisted my head back and looked Kesrat in the eyes one last time. "I gave you 1 chance," I said. "That was the rule I came with. 1 chance. Witnessed and recorded. Remember that later." He waved me away like a bad smell. The guards marched me down a long corridor with walls of dark metal, and while they dragged me, I did one small thing. I let my chin drop, as if I were defeated, and I pressed my thumb hard against my own collarbone, against a spot just beneath the skin. I felt a tiny warmth bloom there, a signal no Korvath sensor was built to find, because it did not broadcast anything at all. It simply stopped broadcasting. For 6 years, that quiet implant had been sending one repeating message into the dark, a message that meant all is well. Now it had gone silent, and somewhere very far away, on ships with dark hulls and patient crews, Silence meant something very specific. They threw me into a cell on the lowest ring of the fortress station. The door slammed. The lights were dim and orange. I sat down on the metal bench, alone in the belly of an enemy fortress the size of a small moon, a fortress called Iron Maw, and I took a slow breath and started counting. Not counting my fears, counting hours. 72, that was the number. 72 hours from the moment my signal went dark. I had 72 hours to sit in this cell, and Kezrat had 72 hours left to be the most feared warlord in this sector, and only one of us knew the clock was running. Something moved in the shadows of the cell across from mine. A pair of golden eyes opened in the dark, and a soft, hissing voice spoke through the bars. "You are the human," the voice said, "the one from the throne hall. The guards were laughing about you." I stood and walked to my bars. The prisoner across from me stepped into the orange light. He was Ashari, one of the refugees, slender and scaled, with those wide golden eyes that his people were known for. His clothes were torn, and he moved like someone who had been hungry for a long time. "My name is Clara," I said, and yes, they were laughing. "People usually do, right before." "Right before what?" he asked. I smiled at him through the bars. "Right before they stop," I said. His name was Seth, and over the hours that followed, he told me everything. He told me how the Korvath ships had come out of the dark and taken his convoy, 3,000 people fleeing a dying colony, people who had been promised safe passage under Terran protection. He told me about the 12 conquered systems, about tribute fleets and hostage princes, about how Kezrat kept whole worlds obedient through fear. He asked me, more than once, why humans would care about strangers they had never met. "Because we were strangers once," I told him. "A long time ago, when our own world was breaking, we called into the dark for help, and nobody came. Nobody. So my species made a promise to itself. We would become the ones who come. Every time. For anyone under our word. That promise has a name. We call it the Vanguard." Seth was quiet for a long moment. "One species cannot keep a promise that big," he finally said. "Watch us," I said. The interrogations began on the second day. They came for me with chains that could have held a battle tank, and they sat me in a room of white light across from a Korvath intelligence officer named Dremic, who had a voice like grinding stone and a data slate full of questions. And here is the part that nobody ever believes. I answered every question, honestly, completely, with a smile. "Where is the Terran home fleet?" Dremic demanded. I gave him the coordinates. "Exactly. How many ships does your Accord field?" I told him the number, the real one. He stared at me. Then he laughed, short and harsh, and called me a liar, because the number I had given him was, in his words, insane. No species our size could build that many hulls. No species that young could crew them. He slammed the slate down and demanded the truth, and I gave him the same truth again, and he refused it again, because the truth about humanity sounds exactly like a bluff. That is our oldest trick, and it is not a trick at all. "What is the armament of your capital ships?" he asked on the third session, sweating now, because his superiors wanted answers. I described it, in detail, ranges, yields, rates of fire. Halfway through, he stopped writing. His hand was shaking, just slightly, and I watched him make the choice that every one of Kezrat's officers had been trained to make. He chose not to believe me. He stamped my file with a word that meant deception and reported to his warlord that the human was feeding them fantasies to inspire fear. Kezrat, I am told, found that very funny. On the second night, Seth whispered to me through the bars, "Clara, why do you tell them the truth?" "Because it is the kindest thing I can do," I said. "Every officer who believes me will pull his family off this station in the next 2 days. I am not here to destroy these people, Seth. I am here to give every single one of them a fair warning and a way out. What they do with it is their choice." "You keep speaking as if something is coming," he said. I lay back on my bench and looked at the ceiling, and thought about dark hulls in deep space, engines lighting one by one, a signal gone quiet, and a promise older than my grandmother. "Something is always coming," I said. "For us, it is family." It was the third day when the alarms changed. I had learned the rhythm of the station by then, the shift bells, the patrol steps, the hum of the reactors through the floor. So when a new sound cut through Iron Maw, a rising three-tone wail I had not heard before, I sat up straight and felt my heart begin to pound, not with fear, but with something much warmer. Boots thundered past our cells. Guards were shouting in the Korvath tongue, and Seth translated with growing confusion. Sensor contact, deep space, extreme velocity. They think it is a debris storm. They are saying nothing real moves that fast. I stood up and walked to my bars and gripped the cold metal, and I could not stop smiling. "It is not debris," I said. Above us, in the Fortress Command Center, a junior Korvath sensor officer was staring at his screen as a wall of returns resolved out of the void, thousands of signatures in perfect formation, coming on like a tide, and according to the records we captured later, he said one sentence that I would like carved somewhere someday, because it was the first fully accurate description of my species ever spoken in that sector. He said, "That is not a fleet. That is a migration. The Vanguard did not arrive with sirens or threats. It arrived the way night arrives. One moment the stars around Iron Maw were empty, and the next moment they were not. From the narrow viewport of my cell, I watched them come out of the dark, and even I, who had grown up beneath those hulls, felt my breath catch. Ships the color of deep water, long and silent, sliding into position around the fortress in a perfect sphere. Hundreds became thousands. They did not fire. They did not shout. They simply took every exit, every lane, every inch of sky, until Iron Maw, the terror of 12 systems, sat inside a closed fist of quiet metal. Seth pressed against his bars, staring past me at the viewport, and his golden eyes were huge. "Clara," he whispered, "whose ships are those?" "Mine," I said softly. "Those are mine. Every one of them came for me, and now every one of them has come for you too. 3,000 of you." That was the promise. The station shook, very gently, as tractor anchors the size of city blocks locked on from a dozen directions. The lights flickered. Somewhere far above us, I knew, Kesrat was standing in his command center, watching his sensors tell him something his whole life had taught him was impossible. And then the Vanguard spoke. It came through every speaker on the station at once, on every channel, in flawless Korvath, a calm human voice that I knew very well. Admiral Margaret Lane, commander of the 1st Vanguard, a gray-haired woman who had once taught me to play chess and never once let me win. "Fortress Iron Maw," she said, "you are holding one of ours, and 3,000 souls under her protection. Return them, and we leave your space forever. This offer expires when she says it does. I want you to sit with that last sentence the way the Korvath had to. Not when the fleet said so. Not when the Admiral said so. When she says it does." In one sentence, the Vanguard told an entire empire that the small, soft creature in their lowest cell was the ranking authority over the largest fleet they had ever seen, and that they had spent 3 days laughing at the person holding their future in her hands. The corridor outside my cell had gone completely silent. Every guard was frozen, listening. Then Kesrat answered, and he answered the only way Pride knows how. Iron Maw's outer batteries opened fire on the Vanguard. I closed my eyes. "One chance," I whispered. "I gave you one chance." What happened next lasted 11 minutes, and I will describe it exactly as it was, because the truth is more frightening than any exaggeration. The Vanguard did not destroy Iron Maw. It disarmed it. Precision fire, thread-thin and surgical, walked across the fortress and removed things. The gun batteries went dark, one by one, clipped off at their mounts. The engine cores were severed from their fuel lines. The shield emitters were burned away like candles being pinched out. 11 minutes, thousands of strikes, and not one strike touched a habitat ring, a life support line, or a prison level. When the 11th minute ended, Iron Maw was perfectly intact, fully pressurized and completely helpless. The guards in our corridor had stopped pretending to stand watch. One of them, a young one, had taken off his helmet and was just sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at nothing. I actually felt for him. His whole world had been the biggest fish in the water, and he had just learned about the ocean. Seth's voice was barely a breath. They could have killed everyone. Why did they not? Because fear of what we did not do, I said, lasts longer than fear of what we did. My people learned that on our own world, the hardest way there is. Restraint is not weakness, Seth. Restraint is the loudest thing power can say. The breaching began an hour later. We heard it before we saw it, a deep resonant tone as boarding craft sealed against the hull, then the whine of cutters, and then human voices in the corridors of Iron Maw, calm and clear, speaking Korvath through translators, and the words they were saying were not threats. They were instructions. Lay down your weapons. Move to the marked areas. You will not be harmed. Food and medical stations are being set up on Ring 7. The Vanguard Marines came down our corridor in dark gray armor, moving without hurry, weapons lowered. They looked so ordinary and so completely unstoppable at the same time. A Korvath guard 3 times the size of the lead Marine set his rifle on the floor and put his hands on his head, and the Marine nodded to him politely, actually politely, and said thank you, and kept walking. The lead Marine stopped in front of my cell. Through the visor I saw a broad, weathered face and a small smile. He put a cutter to my lock, and the door fell open, and he stepped back and snapped a salute. Sergeant Daniel Cross, 1st Vanguard, he said. Ambassador Hart. It is very good to see you, ma'am. The fleet is holding position and the station is secure. Whenever you are ready, we will get you out of here. Your call, ma'am. I stepped out of that cell, and I stood in the corridor, and I rolled my shoulders, and 3 days of chains and cold benches fell off me like dust. Behind me, Marines were already cutting open Seth's cell and every cell on the ring, and I could hear Ashari voices rising, disbelieving, then weeping, then something like singing. Sergeant Cross waited for my orders, and I know he expected me to say, "Take me to the shuttle." Instead, I looked up toward the top of that broken fortress, toward a throne hall of black stone where a warlord had burned my name and laughed. "We are not done, Sergeant," I said. "Take me to Kesrat." They brought me into the throne hall through the same great doors as before, and I will admit, I had thought about this walk for 3 days. The hall was exactly as I remembered it, the black stone floor, the towering pillars, the banners of conquered worlds. Only the people had changed. Where hundreds of armored warriors had stood laughing, there now stood Vanguard Marines in quiet gray, and along the walls, under guard, the disarmed generals of the Korvath Dominion. And on the steps below his own throne, no longer sitting on it, stood Kesrat. He was still enormous. He was still wrapped in his cloak of conquered banners, but something had gone out of him, the way air goes out of a sealed room, and when I crossed that floor toward him, my footsteps were the only sound in the hall. I stopped in front of him, on the exact spot where my credentials had burned. The scorch mark was still there on the stone. I stood on it. Then I raised one finger and pointed at his chest. "One," I said, "one warlord." I did not laugh. That was the difference between us, in the end. I never once laughed. "You have questions," I told him. "I can see them stacking up behind your eyes. So let me save you the trouble, because you deserve the truth, all of it, and so do they." I turned and looked at his generals and at the cameras that were still recording, still broadcasting to every vassal lord in 12 systems, because we had made very sure the feed stayed live. "I was never a hostage," I said. "I was a door." The hall was so silent I could hear the ventilation. "Terran law is strict," I continued. "We do not invade, we do not conquer, we cannot bring our fleet into another power's space without lawful cause, witnessed and recorded. So when you took 3,000 refugees under our protection, we did not send our fleet, we sent me. One ambassador, one offer, one chance, exactly as our law requires. And you, in front of your entire court, on your own cameras, rejected the offer, burned my credentials, and took a Terran ambassador hostage. You did not capture me, Kezrat. You signed the warrant that brought them here. My retinal feed recorded every second of it. You built the door, and then you opened it yourself. I watched it land on him. I watched 3 days of confusion collapse into one terrible understanding, that every move in this game had been mine, including the move where he thought he had won. The small, soft creature, I said quietly, was the trap. One of his generals made a sound low in his throat. Kezrat's 4 eyes moved from me to the Marines, to the cameras, and back to me, and when he spoke, his stone-grinding voice had a crack in it. "Then take your revenge," he said. "Take my fleet, my worlds, my tribute. That is how this ends. That is how it always ends." "No," I said, "and this is the part your kind of power can never predict." I turned to Sergeant Cross and nodded, and the great doors opened again, and into that throne hall walked the people Kezrat had spent a lifetime stepping on. Representatives of the 12 conquered systems, freed from the hostage decks that morning, Ashari elders, delegates in worn clothes with unbroken backs, and walking at their head, standing straighter than I had ever seen him, was Seth. "Terra claims nothing here," I announced, loudly enough for every camera. "Not one world, not one ship, not one coin of tribute. The Vanguard will stand at anchor while these 12 systems, these people, decide the future of this sector for themselves. The negotiation you refused to have with me, Kezrat, you will now have with them. And they hold all the leverage, because it is parked outside your window." I stepped back. That is humanity's actual secret, the one nobody believes until they see it. Our greatest weapon has never been the fleet. It is that we win everything and then hand it to someone else. The talks lasted hours, and I stood aside and let them run, and the freed delegates found their voices one by one, and it was a beautiful, messy, living thing to watch. But pride like Kezrat's does not go quietly, and near the end, he made his last move. It was Seth who caught it. Seth, who had spent weeks on this station listening, memorizing patrol routes and duty rosters through the bars of a cell, the way prisoners do. He suddenly went rigid, staring at a Korvath technician standing too casually near a console at the edge of the hall, a console that should have had 2 operators, not 1, on a station where every system was supposedly dead. "That man," Seth called out, his voice ringing off the stone. "That console. It is a hidden battery command. There is a dead man's weapon aimed at the refugee ships. Kezrat's personal failsafe. I heard the guard speak of it. If he falls, the ships burn." The hall erupted. Marines moved like water. The technician was down and pinned in 3 seconds, and combat engineers tore the console open and found exactly what Seth had said they would find. One last hidden gun, charged and locked onto the transports carrying 3,000 freed souls, waiting for a single command from a defeated warlord's hand. I walked back to Kezrat, and this time I let him see exactly what was behind my eyes. "Even now," I said, "even beaten, even witnessed, you reached for them one last time. Thank you. Because every vassal lord in 12 systems just watched you do it, and now not one of them will ever kneel to you again. You have taken your own crown off, in front of everyone, twice in 1 week. You may be the most helpful enemy I have ever had." His generals turned their backs on him. In Korvath culture, I learned later, that is the end of everything. One by one, in front of the cameras, they turned, until Kezrat stood alone on the steps of a throne that no longer meant anything, and the cloak of conquered banners hung on him like a costume. And then he asked me the question, the real one. The one I had crossed 400 light-years to answer. "Why," he said, and his voice was almost gentle now, almost lost. "Why would your whole species come for one of you? One life, one small life. It is not efficient, it is not rational. Why?" I looked at him for a long moment, and I gave him the truth, the same way I had given the truth to his interrogator, knowing it would sound impossible. "Because that is the only reason any of us agree to go out alone," I said. The Vanguard stayed at anchor for 40 days, and in those 40 days it fired not one more shot, claimed not 1 meter of ground, and changed that sector more than a century of war ever had. I watched the 12 systems write their charter in a conference room on Ring 7 of Iron Maw, which the delegates voted to rename. They called the station First Light, which I thought was a little dramatic, and which also made me cry in a supply closet where nobody could see, so perhaps they knew what they were doing. The 3,000 refugees went home on Terran transports, escorted by Ashari crews who insisted on flying the lead ships themselves. Hezrat was handed over to a tribunal formed by the 12 systems, judged by the very people he had ruled, under their own new laws, with Terra sitting in the gallery as a witness and nothing more. They did not execute him. I want that on the record because it matters. They sentenced him to labor, rebuilding the colony worlds his fleets had stripped, under the supervision of the people who lived there. Somewhere out there right now, a former warlord is laying water pipes on a world he once conquered, and his supervisor is an Ashari engineer who used to be his prisoner. His generals, the ones who cooperated, were paroled into the new coalition's service. The young guard, who had taken off his helmet in my cell corridor, I am told, now works search and rescue. People are not their worst commander. My species bets everything on that idea. And then, on the 41st day, the Vanguard left. That was the part that unsettled the galaxy most of all, more than the arrival, more than the 11 minutes. Thousands of ships that had held absolute power over an entire sector simply formed up, dipped their bows toward First Light in something like a bow, and went home, taking nothing. The galactic networks argued about it for a year. Empires do not do that, the analysts kept saying. Which was exactly the point. We are not one. Admiral Lane and I had dinner on her flagship the night before the fleet departed. She beat me at chess, twice, and over the second game she said the thing I have carried ever since. Clara, she said, moving her knight, every generation of ours gets one chance to teach the galaxy what the word human means. You just spent ours. Spend the next one just as well. I did not fully understand her until 8 months later. 8 months later, I stood in the antechamber of another throne hall, in another empire, at the far end of a different arm of the sky. The Velador Ascendancy, older than the Korvath, prouder, colder, and holding, as it happened, 400 miners from a Terran-protected outpost that their border fleet had seized. History does not repeat, my grandmother used to say, but it rhymes. The doors opened, and I walked alone across a floor of white crystal toward a high seat where Lord Vorik of the Ascendancy waited, with his court arranged around him like frost. He was beautiful and terrible, tall as two of me, robed in silver, and as I approached, I watched him do the thing they always do. I watched him count me. 1, he said, and his thin mouth began to curve. 1 human. They send 1. His courtiers tittered. And then something happened that had never happened before. In all the years my species has been walking alone into rooms like that one. An advisor leaned in close to Vorik's ear. I could not hear the words, but I saw them land. I saw the advisor's hands move as he spoke, sketching something in the air. A sphere, perhaps. A fortress surrounded. A fleet arriving like a tide. I watched Lord Vorik's smile stop halfway. I watched his eyes come back to me and look again, really look, at the small, soft creature standing alone on his beautiful floor. And I watched an ancient lord of an ancient empire hesitate. The galaxy had been talking, you see. In the 8 months since Iron Maw became First Light, the story had traveled farther than any fleet could. They tell it in trade stations and academy classrooms now, I am told, and a new phrase has entered a dozen languages, a diplomatic idiom that translators struggle with because it is not really about numbers. When negotiators want to say do not test this, they have started saying it is a single human. Seth told me that in his last letter. He is an envoy of the coalition now, and he teaches young officers at First Light, and he says he always ends his lectures the same way, with the sentence the censor officer spoke, that is not a fleet, that is a migration, and then he tells them what he learned in a cell on the lowest ring. He learned, he says, that the size of a people cannot be measured in ships. It is measured in how far they will go for one of their own, and how gently they treat everyone else once they get there. Lord Vorik gathered himself. Pride is pride, in every species, and his was 10,000 years deep. He straightened his silver robe and looked down at me and asked the question, but I heard the change in it. It was not mockery anymore. It was a door, opening just a crack. "You come alone," he said carefully, "unarmed. Is your accord truly so confident, or so careless, that it guards its people with nothing?" I smiled at him. I thought of a black stone floor and a burned folio and 11 quiet minutes. I thought of Margaret Lane's knight sliding across a chessboard, of Daniel Cross saying thank you to a surrendering giant, of 3,000 voices singing on a prison ring, of a warlord laying water pipes under a sky he used to own. I thought of my whole strange, stubborn, promise-keeping species, spread thin across the dark, every one of us walking alone, and none of us ever alone. "One," I agreed. "But I should warn you, my bodyguard is the entire Terran Vanguard. The last ruler who laughed at that sentence now works for the people he once ruled, and the station where he laughed has a new name. So before we begin, Lord Vorik, I will offer you what I offer everyone. One chance, witnessed and recorded. You are holding 400 of mine. Release them, and today ends with trade and open skies, and you and I never have to find out what tomorrow looks like." The hall was very quiet. Somewhere behind that white crystal ceiling, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the range of every sensor the Ascendancy possessed, deep space was calm and dark and full of patient engines, and under my skin, against my collarbone, a tiny implant was faithfully repeating its one small message into the void. "All is well. All is well." Lord Vorik looked at me for a long moment. Then he sent for the miners. They came home on my ship, all 400, and the Ascendancy signed the trade accord by the end of the season, and not one shot was fired. And that, I have come to believe, is the true ending of this story, and every story like it. They think our strength is the fleet. It has never been the fleet. The fleet is just what our promise looks like from orbit. Our strength is a sentence, the oldest one we know, the one we carved into ourselves when we were alone in the dark and no one came. The sentence I will keep carrying into throne rooms until my legs give out. No human is ever alone. Count us however you like. The answer always comes out the same.